Hey, how's it going? It's Dan from modular.dev, and we're here again today to go over the web development for the absolute beginner. We got some things to go over as far as how to do your CSS with IDs and classes and that type of thing. So organizing your HTML files in a meaningful way, and we'll go ahead and get started in that in just a second. If you've been following along the previous weeks and you have any questions for me, definitely feel free to reach out. And if you haven't checked out the Thursday stream, I'm going to be starting to do a little bit more unique stuff there as far as a little bit more advanced things. So if this is maybe things that you already know, definitely check out the Thursday stream. And feel free to make a request, even if you are new to web development. Feel free to make a request on Thursdays, and I'll try to get whatever topics you want covered on Thursday. So with that being said, today we're going to go over IDs and classes, and I've kind of put together a starter project here. So if I pull it up in the browser, it looks like this. So we have basically just 4 pictures, and those are put into a grid display. If you remember the grid display from last week, we have display grid and grid template columns, 1FR, 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 which means 3 columns, all of equal size, and then a grid gap of 20 pixels in between each column and row. So that's what we have right now. And this is going to be a good starting point for our project today. So I've been using divs here. We haven't learned divs yet, I don't think. We learned maybe section last week. But divs, sections, all of those are just different containers that you can put things into. So div by itself doesn't really mean anything, and we'll talk a little bit more about the meaning of sections and divs and things like that in a future episode. But for now, just think of it as a container that we're putting things into. So immediately you might see the problem with something like this. If we try to put, let's say, a div tag up here in the style section, and then we want to put all of this display grid stuff there. Let's go ahead and put it on a separate line. And we'll get rid of this style here. So if I do that, we have grid. This would be a display grid, and each of these would be a display grid. And they each would have their own 3 columns. So that's not what we want. Let's go ahead and see what this would look like. It may not even change anything. Yeah, it does. It has basically 3 placeholder columns that we're not using. And that's because we put this style on the entire div. So you may be wondering then, how would you go about doing this? You could put this as maybe a different HTML element entirely, but there's got to be a better way, and there is. So before we get to that, though, I do want to talk a little bit about cleanliness of your HTML and your CSS. So up until now, we've been putting our styles up at the top, and that's been fine for what we've needed. But I think it's about time we start using the best practice, and that's actually having a separate CSS file. So it's really easy to do. Visual Studio Code or whatever editor you want. You just want to make another file in the same folder as your HTML file. So if I create a CSS file here, maybe style.css, you can call it whatever you like, and we'll just copy these styles from the head style tag into this style.css. And we'll hit save, and now we can get rid of this style tag here. That in and of itself isn't going to do anything, though. We do need to reference that file. So we do link href, and then we put style.css, and then we do rel style sheet. And rel just stands for relationship, so this is the relationship that it has. And I think that's good. Let's go ahead and run this, make sure it still works. Oh, we already have it running. Okay, yeah, it still works. We still have our problem. And just one second. I'm going to bring something up. Okay. So sorry about that. So this CSS Selectors cheat sheet that I just brought up here, this is something that somebody at FreeCodeCamp put together, and they're going to go over a lot of the things that we're talking about here. You know, this first one selects the element with the head tag. And that's what we've been using so far, right? We've been selecting things by tag, and that's just the name of the tag. But there's other ways to do it. And where'd that go? Here it is. We see the dot in front of something, and that means it's a class. So in this case, .red selects all elements with the red class, and hashtag nav selects the elements with the nav ID. So let's go ahead and learn what those are. In this case, we don't want all of our divs to have a display grid. We only want this main one here. So what we may want to do is put an ID on this, which then we can call it whatever we want. Maybe we call it, let me get out of this. Maybe we call it main grid. That's fine. And then in the style.css, we can put hashtag main grid and put our styles in there. Okay, let's go ahead and refresh the page. And now you'll see that the style only applies to that outer div, which is what we want. However, we may want to reuse this code on a different grid, potentially. And if that's the case, we don't want to use ID, because ID is supposed to be unique. That's kind of how we want to structure this. If we have a unique section and we want styling specific to that and to nothing else, we would put an ID. And maybe that's what we want here. But I think in general, when we're doing like a grid display type of thing, it may be a good idea to make a class of grid. And what that is now I can put class of grid on any div that I want, or any section, or anything really. I'm not actually referencing the tag name here anymore. I'm just referencing the well, here I'm referencing the ID, but if I change this to .grid, now I'm referencing the class. I'm not referencing the tag name at all. So I could have an entirely different HTML tag that still uses the same class name. And again, you want to use class names if you're going to be using this type of styling on something else in the future, or if you even think that you might want to be using it in the future. I would put a class on there. The only time you're going to want to use an ID is if you know it's going to be specific to that thing, and you probably are going to have a good reason for that. Because in general, we want to reuse styles if we can, right? We don't want to have to rewrite the same thing more than once. Okay, so we can use a dot in front of it, which stands for class. So anything, and if you kind of hover over in Visual Studio, you'll see element class equal grid. It's kind of the hint that it's giving you. So any element that has a class of grid will satisfy this. Same thing if you hover over the image, any element with the image tag will satisfy that. So that's kind of useful if you're just learning the CSS selectors. You can kind of hover over it. Again, if I put this back to a hashtag, now it's going to be looking for anything that has an ID of grid, which that's not what we want, so let's put it back. All right. Now, let's talk about these images here, because what I really want to have happen is I've got this nice SVG here. Let's see if I can open it up. Let's see. Yeah, here it is. Looks like a little star with a plus sign on it. So what I want to do is I want to put that at the top right of each image and allow somebody to potentially click that to like the image. So let's go ahead and try doing that. So image source equals, what did I call that? Add like.svg. Okay. And let's go ahead and put that on all 4 of these images here. So if we do that, and if we just hit refresh, that's not what we want, right? This image is now underneath this image, and that's not what we want. We want it on the top right. So if you remember from last week, we talked about position absolute and position relative. So let's go ahead and give this an inline style of position absolute with a top of 10 pixels and a right of 10 pixels. Okay, what is that going to do? As it stands right now, it's going to put it in the top right of the entire screen, which is not what we want. So we want to put a inline style here of position relative. That way the absolutely positioned thing will know what it should be relative to. So now if we put relative on that, we should see this star coming up here in the top right, and that's exactly what we want. Now we would have to copy and paste this same style for all of these images, which is a bit of a pain, right? And if we change something, maybe we want it on the left side, now all of a sudden we have to update all of them to the left side, which isn't that big a deal when you only have 4, but when you have a lot, it is a big deal. So if I do this, they're all still going to be over here because we didn't put position relative on the div. So let's go ahead and do that. And if you noticed, we've got a little bit of a mess right now. We have inline styles everywhere. It will work. Right now it's in the top left. It will work, but it looks messy. And that's kind of what the goal of this tutorial is, to show you how to use classes and IDs to organize your code. So if you think about it, these divs here are all the same style, and they're all kind of wrapping these images. They're kind of like an image wrapper, right? So I would probably put a class on here called image wrapper. And there we go. Now, if we go ahead and put that class on all of these divs, now all we have to do is in our CSS, all we got to do is say image wrapper dot image wrapper, I should say, because it's a class name, and say position relative. And there we go. Now it will look exactly the same. Now if we want to change the style, maybe we want it to have a background color of some kind. Let's just say red. I don't know if it'll actually show up. Yeah, it does. Because it's behind the images. So we can do that. And notice by just changing in one spot, it's going to update all of those with that class name. So that is really handy. All right, I'm going to get rid of that background. So now let's go ahead and look at another piece of code that we can improve. So this image here, the second image in each group, we have the image wrapper, and then we've got the main image, and then we've got the little add like image. So again, we can do the same type of thing. So let's put a class of like image. I don't know. You can call it whatever you want. And now we can take this code from the style attribute and put it over here in the CSS. And I'll put this on different lines so that we can see that nicely. Let's go ahead and do that same class. I'm just going to duplicate the entire thing. Okay. And now we refresh and everything still looks correct. Let's go ahead and put those back in the right corner. And again, all we have to do is change this now. We don't have to change anything in the HTML. And that's kind of the goal, right? We don't want our HTML to be littered with CSS. We want it to be nice and clean and have all of the styling in a separate file, a CSS file. So let's go ahead and just make sure that that worked. Okay, we got everything in the top right now. So that is good. That's what we want. So probably just to do it again, we've been using classes all over the place, but as a reminder, we could use an ID if we wanted to make a specific styling related to a specific element. So in this case, we're going to use ID grid, and we're going to change that from a dot to a hashtag. And again, whether or not this would be an ID or a class would depend on how you want to structure your HTML, and whether or not you know you find that you may be reusing that style in the future. Let's go ahead and refresh though, and you can see it still works the exact same way. So that's the main thing I want to cover today, but let's go ahead, since we do have a little bit more time, let's go ahead and look at some other CSS attribute selectors or CSS selectors that we can use. So here's another one. If you look at this fourth one here, in this case it's div dot something. So if we want to put, let's just say we want to put a section on this one instead of a div. And again, we'll talk about why you may use certain things over the other in a different video, but let's say we want to use section here. Right now, that's going to work because we didn't specify any tag names here. All we said was it has to have a class name of image wrapper. Now, if we wanted to put a div in front of that, that's going to say any divs that have that class name image wrapper. So notice there's no space or anything. It's div dot image wrapper. And if we do that, this second one here, that's a section, won't have that styling. It won't have that position relative style. So that's how you can specifically target a specific element with a class name. Now what else can you do? You can target a specific element that does not have a class name too, and what you do is you put this colon and then a not in front of it, and then that has parentheses. It's kind of like a function if you've ever used functions before, and this will target anything that does not have that class. In our case, we don't want to do that, but you can do that. What else can you do? You can say, okay, here's a good one. So we have this grid, right? We've got this grid, and we have these elements underneath it. And in fact, what we could do is we maybe don't even have to put this image wrapper here. Maybe we would just want to say all of the direct descendants of the grid would be position relative. So how could we do that? We could say hashtag grid, and then we could use this greater than sign, and then we could say star, which means anything. So this would say look at the grid ID, or look at the ID with, or look at the element with ID grid, and grab all of its direct descendants and give them position relative. And that's going to do the exact same thing. So depending on how, I wouldn't say there's necessarily a right or wrong way to do it. I think if you're sure that your grid needs to have position relative on all of its direct descendants, yeah, go ahead and do it this way. That way you don't have to be writing class image wrapper all the time. But if that's not going to be the case for you, then make sure to just put classes on things. But yeah, let's see, one more thing, and then that'll probably be enough for today, is the attribute selector. So if you notice here, we have a source attribute on this image. And I just deleted the class for a second to show you that if we refresh now, that style doesn't work because it doesn't have that class name anymore. So what could we do instead if we wanted to be even, I don't want to say lazier, but I guess you could think of it that way. If we don't want our HTML to be littered with all these class names, we could do image, and we could do this bracket after here, and that bracket's going to say look for any attributes on image. In this case, source is the attribute, or src is the attribute we want. So we could put that in there, and then if we do it just like this, it's going to say all of the images with the source attribute, which that's not going to really do anything. So we want all of them where the source attribute is add like.svg. And let's just put this in there. Okay, so that should do the same thing. Remember, this one still does not have that class name, but now we've got it in the top right. So I don't think I would necessarily recommend this. I mean, I would use and I do use the attribute selector for things, but I wouldn't probably have it looking for a specific file like that, because if you ever decide to change your SVG, then you got to change your whole attribute selector. I would probably just keep it as class equal like image, but you are feel free to do it however you want. If I get rid of all these classes now, I've got an entire HTML document with no classes. And like I say, I wouldn't necessarily recommend that. I think classes are great. And another thing that you can use this for, when we talk about classes and IDs, is when you start getting into JavaScript. So we're not going to do JavaScript for a long time in this series, but let's just talk about it just for a second. So if I put a class of image wrapper here, and let's go ahead and refresh this. I'm going to open up in the developer tools, and I'm just going to go to the console tab. So just a little intro to JavaScript, and then we'll be done. Document get element by ID is a function that you can do in JavaScript to get the element by ID. So in the case that we had with the grid, you could do that, and now this function returns back this grid you can see here. And you can do document.get elements by class name. So I'll put image wrapper here, and again we now have a collection with one, because we didn't put it on all of them, with one element with that class name. So I don't think it's necessarily important for you to know JavaScript at this moment, but if you ever do need to use JavaScript for anything, you can use these IDs and classes to easily get those elements in JavaScript. And there is one more thing, document.query selector and query selector all, if you're expecting multiple things. which actually takes in a CSS selector. So I could do any of these things that I did in my CSS. Maybe I want to do this one. So I'll grab that and I'll paste that in there. And you can see we have 4 elements coming back. So all of these things that we're using in CSS, we can use in JavaScript too. And that's just a little added bonus that I thought I'd share with you. So I think that's it. Next time we're going to go over, let's see, what are we going to do next time? I think we're going to probably talk a little bit about when to use certain elements, when to use a div, when to use a section, when to use an article, that type of thing. We may also cover some more advanced CSS, but we're going to start transitioning into actually working on an actual website, because that's what we're here for, right? So that's probably where we're going to start next time. We have the basics. I mean, we have the very basics kind of down now. And now it's time to start worrying about adding links, adding multiple pages, that type of thing. So that's what we're going to cover next time. At least just start on that anyways. And I think that's it. So let me know if you have any questions. And definitely if you found this useful, give this video a like and feel free to subscribe. All right, thanks.